He'd seen things out on the frontier that would make a sane man as soul-shrivel blizzards that swallowed whole towns, rustlers with hearts as cold as a grave, and the kind of loneliness that gnaws on a man's bones till there is nothing left but dust. But this was different. This was a sight he never expected, a scene so wrong and so full of raw fury that it hit him square in the gut. A gut punch of hell. The dust of the high plains was a constant companion to Silas Silstone, toting his worn boots and the brim of his hat, and settling into the deep lines etched around his eyes. His ranch, a quiet cluster of sun-bleached wood and weathered corrals, was his world, a world of predictable rhythm and hard, honest work. The only thing that ever broke the monotony was the occasional visit from the traveling preacher or the monthly trip into town for supplies. But today, the silence was shattered not by the wind, but by the frantic, panicked clatter of a horse and buggy pulling up to his gate. It was a couple he'd seen around, the Pearsons, a stern-faced pair who ran the general store in Redemption. But it wasn't them he focused on. It was the young woman they held between them. She was Mary Beth, their daughter-in-law, a sweet-natured girl who'd married their boy, Jedediah, just a few months back. Only now, she was different. Her long, red hair was matted with dirt, and her face was a mask of terror. As the buggy jolted to a stop, her in-laws pushed her out, and the sight that made Silas's blood run cold was that she was practically naked, dressed only in a tattered shift that barely covered her. He stepped out of the shadow of his porch, his hand instinctively resting on the pistol holstered at his hip. The Pearsons didn't even acknowledge him, their faces set in a grim, self-righteous resolve as they began to speak. "She's a witch," the old man spat, his voice a low growl. "Brought nothing but trouble to our family. Jedediah's been sick since she came into our home. We're casting her out. She's got no place here." Silas felt a quiet, simmering rage begin to boil within him. His mind, usually as clear as a desert sky, was clouded with disbelief. He'd known Jedediah had been laid up with a bad fever. The next morning, the air was still thick with the previous day's dust, and the unexpected problem only grew. Mary Beth, after being given a spare shirt and a pair of Sil pants that were too big for her, was huddled in a chair by the hearth, a cup of coffee steaming in her hands. She wouldn't meet his eyes, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames as if they held the answers she couldn't speak. Silas tried to talk to her, to get a name or a destination from her, but she remained silent, a ghost in his own home. The first real obstacle came in the form of Sheriff Brody, a man whose gut was as big as his ego. Brody rode up on his speckled gray mar, his face a storm cloud as he dismounted. "Silas, word's gotten around about you talking in that woman. Cyrus Pearson says she's a menace, a witch." Brody's voice was a slow, deliberate drawl, each word a stone being dropped. Silas stepped out onto the porch, his posture as straight and unyielding as a fence post. "She's a girl in need, Brody. Nothing more." Brody just shook his head, a wry, knowing smile playing on his lips. "The Pearsons have a lot of sway in this town, Silas. They're saying she put a curse on Jedediah. Folks are getting riled up. You're putting yourself in the middle of a bad situation." Their conversation was a tense dance of unspoken threats and cautious restraint. Brody wanted to be seen doing his duty, but he also respected Silas, who was known as a man of few words and strong convictions. The silence between their short, clipped sentences was heavier than any argument could be. Finally, Brody said, "I'm warning you, Silas. You get this thing sorted out. Don't let it become my problem." The sheriff's words hung in the air long after he rode away. Silas knew the Pearsons wouldn't let this go. But a new complication arrived later that afternoon. A rider, a young man with the tension in Silas's cabin was as thick as a summer storm. Thomas paced the small space, his boots thudding against the wooden floorboards, while Mary Beth remained silent, a statue of grief and fear. Silas, watching her, felt a familiar ache in his chest, a ghost from his past. He hadn't felt it in years, not since he'd left Missouri and his old life behind. He was a man who lived in the present, but now the past was a weight he couldn't shake. Suddenly, a memory, sharp and vivid, cut through his thoughts. He was a boy again, standing by a cold, still river. His younger sister, Sarah, was there, and she was crying. Their father, a harsh, unforgiving man, was yelling at her, accusing her of bringing bad luck to the farm. Sarah had always been a little different, a little more wild and free. Their father, consumed by old superstitions, had taken it out on her. He had accused her of being a witch, of talking to the animals, of making the crops fail. Silas had just stood there, a knot of fear and helplessness in his stomach, unable to stand up to his father. He had watched as his father stripped his sister of her dignity and chased her from their home. She had disappeared into the woods, and he had never seen her again. The memory was a sharp shard of glass in his heart. The fear and shame he felt then, for his own inaction, was the reason he had left home, left everything behind to build a new life where he could be his own man. But now, here he was, watching another girl suffer the same fate. Mary Beth's story was an echo of his sister's, a cruel twist of fate that brought his greatest failure back to haunt him. The emotional walls he built came tumbling down. The quiet, calm cowboy, the man who was never caught off guard, was now a boy again, a raw wound of regret. He felt a flash of old rage, not at the Pearsons, but at himself for not acting sooner. "I won't let it happen again," he whispered, the words surprising even him. Thomas stopped pacing and looked at him, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about?" Thomas asked. Silas finally met Mary Beth's eyes. The ride back to redemption was tense and silent. Silas and Thomas rode side by side, with Mary Beth on Thomas's horse. As they neared the town, a crowd had gathered outside the general store, their faces a mix of curiosity and simmering anger. The Pearsons stood on the porch, their old man and woman of the law facade in full effect. Silas knew this was the moment of reckoning. He had faced down armed men, but this was different. He was facing down superstition, mob mentality, and the very thing that had haunted him for a lifetime, a fear of being a helpless bystander. He dismounted, his boots hitting the packed earth with a thud that echoed in the silence. Thomas and Mary Beth stayed back, a silent testament to the fragile trust they had placed in him. Silas walked to the center of the crowd, his voice low but clear. "Cyrus, you need to tell the truth. Why did you really do this?" Cyrus sneered, his eyes filled with a venomous rage. "The truth is right there, Silas. She's a curse. Ever since she showed up, Jedediah's been sick. This is God's will." "No, it's not," Silas said, the words cutting through the air like a knife. He turned to the crowd, his voice rising, each word holding the weight of his past. "A man doesn't just get rid of his daughter-in-law because his son is sick. There's another reason. Jedediah and Mary Beth were getting close. They were getting ready to leave. You two were losing your free labor, weren't you?" A gasp went through the crowd. The Pearsons' faces twisted in a mixture of fear and fury. "He's lying!" The old woman screamed. The climax of the tension came when a man from the crowd, a burly farmer with a shotgun, stepped forward. "You're protecting a witch, Silas. You've gone too far." Silas felt the cold, familiar terror from his past. The moment everything seemed lost. But then, a low, groaning sound came from behind the counter of the store. The back door opened, and a figure, pale and weak, stumbled out. The aftermath was a silent, solemn affair. The Pearsons, their reputation shattered and their cruelty exposed, were taken into custody by Sheriff Brody, who, now that the crowd was on Silas's side, was all too happy to do his duty. Jedediah, weak but alive, was cared for by his brother Thomas and Mary Beth. Silas, however, was left with a different kind of wound. He was physically unharmed, but the emotional cost of the confrontation was a heavy burden. He had faced his demons, but the victory felt hollow. He stood in the middle of the street, a lone figure in the silence that had replaced the mob's fury. The loneliness of the cowboy was never more pronounced than it was then. Even with a crowd of people around him, a feeling of isolation settled in. He had done the right thing, faced down the town and brought a truth to light that many would have preferred to keep hidden. But he hadn't done it for them. He had done it for a memory, for a ghost of a sister he had failed. Mary Beth, now safely reunited with her husband, came to him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice still thin from the ordeal. Silas just nodded. "I didn't do it for you," he said, the words blunt and honest. "I did it for my sister. A long time ago, I let something like this happen to her." The confession, so long buried, felt like a weight being lifted from his chest. A final chance appeared, but it came with a risk. Thomas offered Silas a share in his ranch, a new life, a family he could be a part of. But Silas knew he couldn't stay. The trail back to his ranch was long and quiet, and Silas rode with a different kind of purpose. The victory wasn't in the defeat of the Pearsons or the saving of a girl, but in the internal battle he had finally won. He had faced his greatest fear, the one he had tried to outrun his whole life. He had stood up for the helpless, and in doing so, he had healed a part of himself he thought was broken forever. He was no longer just a lone cowboy on the plains. He was a man who had confronted his past and found the courage to live with the truth. His solitude was no longer a retreat from the world, but a choice born of self-knowledge. He was transformed, not into a hero, but into a whole person. As he reached his ranch, the quiet was no longer heavy. It was a peaceful silence, a quiet that promised new beginnings. The world hadn't changed. The dust was still there. The sun was still as hot as a forge. But he had learned that sometimes the quietest actions have the loudest echoes. He dismounted, a profound sense of peace settling over him. He walked into his cabin and looked around at the simple, honest life he had built. He knew that one day, another story might find him, another journey might begin. But for now, he was home. And as the sun set on the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the land he loved, he spoke a single final sentence to the silence, a phrase that encapsulated the whole of his being. A man's worth ain't measured by his victories, but by the quiet choices he makes in the dark.